Good afternoon. Just before we proceed with the necessary protocols, permit me to announce that the heads of state are still in session, but they will be on their way, as well as Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, President of the African Development Bank, pending the delivery of a speech that is supposed to make in the open plenary session. With that being said, we will formally start this much anticipated event. We thank you once again for being with us. His Excellency President Teodoro Obiang Nguema of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea, His Excellency Mr. Azali Assoumani, President of the Union of Comoros, His Excellency Mr. Julius Maada Bio, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, His Excellency, Her Excellency rather, Dr. Samia Suluhu Hassan, President of the United Republic of Tanzania, His Excellency Dr. William Ruto, President of the Republic of Kenya, His Excellency Mr. Daniel Chapo, President of the Republic of Mozambique, and His Excellency Mr. Wale Edu, Honorable Minister of Finance and Coordinating Minister of the Economy, the Federal Republic of Nigeria, Dr. Akinwumi Ayodeji Adesina, President of the African Development Bank Group, Ms. Nados Bekele Thomas, CEO of the African Union Development Agency, AUDA NEPAD, and His Excellency Ambassador Albert Muchanga, AU Commissioner Extraordinaire. Excellencies, distinguished guests, visionary leaders, Africa's finest minds, good afternoon. It really is with great pleasure that I have the privilege of moderating this very short session this afternoon, what we believe is a defining moment for the continent at the heart of Africa's leadership, the African Union headquarters this afternoon. Today, the African Union Commission, the African Development Bank Group, and the African Union Development Agency and the new Partnership for Africa's Development, AUDA NEPAD, will unveil two transformative frameworks, and they are as follows: the African Financing Stability Mechanism, AFSM, our own African-led response to debt vulnerabilities, and the Strategic Framework on Key Actions to Achieve Inclusive Growth and Sustainable Development, IGS. We must say off the bat that this is not about economics, but it's about lives, it's about futures, it's about an Africa that moves from reliance to dominance on the global stage. And these reports are not just policy recommendations, they're really powerful visionary calls to action and roadmaps for an Africa that is economically sovereign, financially resilient, and unapologetically ambitious. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the world does not wait, and neither should we. So let's begin. With that being said, I'd like to invite to provide welcome remarks a statesman, a Pan-Africanist, and a leader who has consistently been committed to Africa's financial sovereignty. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm good afternoon welcome to His Excellency Ambassador Albert Muchanga, AUC Commissioner Extraordinaire. Honorable Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you very much, colleagues who are here, and I believe there are other colleagues in the virtual space. We are very, very happy that you can be with us this afternoon. We were supposed to be together yesterday, but because of security issues, it was not possible to get everybody into the room. So we had to reschedule to today. We are happy, but we apologize for any inconvenience that might have been caused. The African Development Bank and the African Union go a long way together. Immediately after the formation of the OAU, one of the first strategic decisions made was to come up with the African Development Bank. And it has grown and continues to grow, and we have deepened our collaboration. And what the event we're going to have this afternoon is an indicator, just an indicator of the various areas where we are collaborating. And when we collaborate like this, it also reinforces the role of the African Development Bank as the knowledge partner to the African Union in the G20. The documents that are going to be unveiled, among others, will be very, very, very critical inputs in the work of the various African Union delegations when they attend the G20 meetings now and in the future. They're going to be very valid for a long time to come. But they also have a very direct impact on the lives of the African people. The strategic framework on key actions to achieve inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa is a direct response to the first aspiration of the African Union Agenda 2063. We envisage an Africa which is moving progressively, anchored on inclusive growth and sustainable development. So that has been operationalized. We envisage an Africa that is going to considerably reduce poverty and move Africa out of, most of our economies, out of their status of being in the middle income trap. And as you go through the document, when it's unveiled, it will require a huge, huge, huge mindset change among policymakers, among individuals. I'll give you just one example, which is from chapter 3 of the strategic framework. It says that if we have GDP growth of 5% between 2023 and 2033. Then we rev it up to 8% up to 2053. And then it stabilizes at 6% up to 2063. The transformation that we're going to achieve is in Africa rising from GDP per capita of $4,800 in 2023 to $65,000 in 2063, and the annual GDP of $160 trillion. When I said this finding in a recent meeting on the free movement of people, I asked the audience, how many of you believe that come 2063, GDP per capita in 2063 will be $65,000? There were very, very few hands. So can we try it again in this audience? How many of you believe that in 2063, Africa's GDP per capita will be $65,000? Let me see a show of hands. I'm one of those. You're allowed to raise both hands. So here we have a majority. It depends. Okay, but the key issue is that we need to act, and act resolutely. If we act resolutely, we are going to achieve that. There should be no self-doubt. We need really to say, this is our vision. We want a progressive Africa. Let's move and do it. If we do it, whatever challenge will come, we shall meet those challenges and continue the journey across. So this is something very, very, very transformative. And now we have put it before the heads of state and government, and we're going to ask the member states to domesticate. During the preparation of this document, I was briefed that for each country that is interested, the economic model that was used to come up with this calculation projection can be done at the national level. So we're going to advocate. And one of the decisions, let's hope it is going to be adopted by the Assembly when they're sitting down. One of the decisions is that each year, the chairperson of the African Union Commission and the President of the African Development Bank should give an annual report to the Assembly on the implementation of the strategic framework at the national, regional, and the continental level. So if we are resolute, we are going to achieve that. And the same for the Africa Financing Stability Mechanism. It's going to save us a lot of resources when we start really implementing it. The heads of state and government have decided on various aspects, one of which is shareholding. But once we have it, I think it is going to really transform Africa considerably. So it's with these few words that I welcome you to this audience, and I'm very, very happy that all of you are very, very, very optimistic that Africa can change course and move towards progress if she so wills it. So let us collectively will it and create the Africa we want. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Honorable His Excellency Ambassador Albert Muchanga, AUC Commissioner Extraordinaire for Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry, and Minerals at the AUC. Indeed, a key architect of Africa's economic integration. Your call for a much more integrated role between the African Union as well as the African Development Bank as the African Union's knowledge and investor partner is very well noted. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to sincerely thank Ambassador Muchanga for working tirelessly to ensure that these frameworks are not just reports but roadmaps to transformation and Africa's economic and financial future. This is not just the result of wishful thinking here, they're the results of rigorous research, policy engagement, and very, very bold vision, and for that, we do want to thank you. I'm going to take a cue from the Chief Economist of the African Development Bank. Do we go on to the President's opening statement, and is that being delivered on his behalf, or we wait for him to arrive?
When he comes.
Okay, fantastic. Well, our second speaker is a leader whose economic insights really are helping shape Africa's financial strategies at the very highest levels. Please give a very warm welcome to Professor Kevin Oramah, the Chief Economist and Vice President of the African Development Bank Group, who, along with his team, has done a phenomenal job putting these frameworks together.
Excellencies, honorable ministers, distinguished guests joining us physically and virtually, good afternoon. Please allow me to stand on existing protocols for want of time. Today, I'm going to be speaking to us on the two main reports that has been developed, as we've heard, in conjunction with the African Union Commission and AUDA NEPAD, under the leadership and guidance of President Akinwumi Adesina, President of the African Development Bank Group, and His Excellency Musa Faki Mahamat, the chairperson of the African Union Commission at the time when he commissioned this report with President Adesina. These two reports, one on the strategic framework on key actions to achieve inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa, was commissioned in 2022 by these two leaders that I have mentioned. And the goal is to find out, through modeling and economic analysis, what it will take for Africa to effectively achieve the first aspiration of the Agenda 2063, quote, a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. The second report that we'll be unveiling today is a technical and operational report on the Africa Financial Stability Mechanism, AFSM for short. And this report was prepared by the African Development Bank Group and the African Union Commission. as per the decisions of the Assembly of Heads of States and Government of the African Union in February 2022, which called for an establishment of an African financing stability mechanism and directed the African Union Commission and the African Development Bank Group to, quote, work with all relevant stakeholders to accelerate operationalization of the mechanism and its growth. I would like to thank profusely my co-editors of this report, Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia State University, seated here, Professor Soji Adelaja of Michigan State University, who actually traveled to be here, but unfortunately is unwell and not able to join us. So he's joining us virtually from the hotel. Dr. Eric Ogunleye of the African Development Bank Group, Commissioner Albert Muchanga of the African Union Commission. These gentlemen have worked tirelessly, working with a large gamut of experts from around the world, consulting with member states and the specialized technical committee on finance, monetary affairs, and so on, the AUSTC for short, to come up with this report. I really thank all for your efforts to do this. So here I'm going to be running through just an introduction and rationale. Then we look into Africa and how we have progressed in order to achieve this laudable goal of achieving inclusive growth in Africa. A brief overview on what challenges we have and how they form opportunities to be able to drive this inclusive growth and sustainable development that we're speaking about, and then go into the strategic actions at a high level, encouraging you to read the report because we really went into granular details on what must be done in order to be able to reach these goals. And then briefly present also the Africa Financing Stability Mechanism, which actually demonstrates for me that our heads of states and government are ahead of the curve. Because even as we're doing this study, which as you will see, recommends having a financing stability mechanism for Africa to show Africa of its debt vulnerability, risks, and other things, they've already made a decision and asked that it be done. I think they deserve a very big round of applause. So here is just to recap, as well of introduction, what I have said already. Africa's commitment to inclusive growth and sustainable development is obvious. In Agenda 2063, it being its first aspiration, and also in Goal 8 of the UN Sustainable Development, which Africa subscribes to. But more importantly, under President Adesina of the African Development Bank Group, there is a high five strategies that have identified 5 key strategic areas of investment for Africa to be able to achieve both Agenda 2063 and also the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These high fives of the African Development Bank sets the pace for what we must do in order to be able to reach the goal which we all seek. And based on what we've done by way of summary, Africa's growth in economic performance is really trailblazing, considering the endogenous and exogenous challenges that countries face, with Africa continuously ranking number 2, the second fastest growing continent in the world, despite all the challenges we have, even in the current global financial systems that upends Africa's development. So that's very good. But we also find in the study that growth, which has averaged about 4% in the past decades, is not enough to be able to drive per capita income up to stages where it can alleviate poverty, create quality jobs for youths in Africa, and be able to achieve the desires and goals that have set in both agendas. And then we go into bold actions that is required. And if there's nothing you take out of this presentation, it is a finding which we had in the report demonstrating that Africa has what it takes to finance its own development domestically and achieve this high rate of growth of 7 to 10%, which is determined to be what will break these vicious cycles of poverty in Africa if we sustain it over the next 40 years. It is possible. Africa can, and Africa should do it. So it doesn't depend. It depends on us to be able to make it happen. Next, let us then go into the recent economic performance and outlook of the continent. And this young lady is asking us, how is Africa performing now? When we look at growth rates in Africa, you can see on the left side of that curve that Africa's GDP growth rate has demonstrated remarkable resilience. Despite global shocks, domestic shocks that has been overlapping and recurrent. Even during COVID-19, Africa's economies was least impacted in terms of GDP growth, and it rebounded very quickly by next year to positive growth, and consistently returns to its second position in terms of GDP growth amongst all the other continents. But as I have said, when you look at the graph on the right, you'll find that we are trailing all other regions in GDP per capita growth for several reasons. Because as our GDP is growing, so is our population also growing. So per capita incomes in Africa then remains very low and is trapping many Africans in poverty. And this is what we need to try and break. How has Africa performed historically? Is it only a short-term spell that we have not been able to achieve these goals? On the graph on the right, you will see that GDP per capita and GDP in Africa has been oscillating. So sometimes have growth spells when the continent is rising, and then other times we have what I call failed takeoffs. And we try to examine what are behind those growth spells. You will find them in the report, and what are behind those failed takeoffs that Africa has had over time. But one great finding there is that if you look at Africa's GDP in 1970 and GDP per capita in 1970, we are not doing much better today. So we have not had significant structural transformation in the structures of our economy, and we have not been able to actually grow at a pace that lifts many Africans out of poverty. But the trend in this growth varies by regions and countries, because several African countries have been able to maintain that threshold of above 7% of GDP growth rate consistently, sometimes for 2 decades. But then after that, something happens. Either a global shock happens or a domestic issue happens, and then the growth crashes again. So Africa is always rising. So in this report, we are trying to see how we can come up with an Africa that is not just always rising, but Africa that rises and stays on top. And here is just demonstrating what the impact of this volatility in growth in Africa is creating. So this is looking at GDP growth in Africa since 1970s, and you see like a cobweb going up and down consistently. So it becomes difficult for the continent to sustain GDP and GDP per capita at levels that creates sufficient jobs and breaks the vicious cycles of poverty. So our growth has been marked by volatility, low GDP per capita growth, endemic poverty, and because of that, low SDG outcomes, even though our GDP remains resilient. Why is it happening? Then we started looking at the macroeconomic dynamics in Africa to search for the patterns during the rises and during the falls. What is happening here? And here are some of the key factors that has always been the sources of the failed takeoffs in many African economies. Number one is inflation rates. We continue to see high upticks in inflation in Africa, despite the excellent work being done by many African countries in aggressive monetary policy tightening by central banks, and also work that's been done in marrying monetary policy with fiscal policy on the continent. We still see continuous return of upticks in inflation, most oftentimes above the required thresholds set even by those countries. This year, in 2024, Africa's inflation average is 18.6%, making it difficult for access to capital and for the benefits of growth to trickle to stakeholders, to citizens, because of higher prices and other things. But what is causing this uptick in inflation, we find that a major part of it is currency depreciation. Our exchange rate market remains volatile as well, responding almost proportionally to policies in the United States because of dollar dependence. So for Africa to be able to sustain growth, we need to think about how to improve domestic currency financing and other measures that allows us not to be too prone to policies that we do not have control over. Next, in the dynamics that has created these challenges is the debt dynamics in Africa. Again, we see similar trends, volatility. Even after debt restructuring and debt forgiveness in Africa, like we had during the HIPC era, we are now back again to a high debt vulnerability, debt risks, risks of debt distress in Africa. And this is not because African countries are not doing well in fiscal policy management. It is because of several other factors which you are going to find in the report. Now, currently, we have 9 African countries that is in debt distress and 11 others who are at high risk of debt distress as well. And this changing structure of debt towards private creditors in Africa is also increasing the cost of debt, increasing the cost of debt refinancing and debt servicing, and that is why the second initiative on the Africa Financial Stability Mechanism to address the debt refinancing risk in Africa becomes very central. And as I have mentioned already, if you look at the graph on the right side, you find that the spread for Africa's payments in capital markets is sometimes 3.5% higher than comparator countries that are rated equally. And that's also what is called the Africa premium with regard to Africa's risks. And because of that, the proportion of debt service in Africa is actually depriving countries scarce fiscal capacity to be able to address growth-enhancing sectors, investing in health, in human capital, in agriculture, and in education, and all those key sectors that actually drives growth. If you look on the right of this graph, you will find that 13% of Africa's incomes is actually spent on debt servicing alone, not debt repayment. And Africa lost in 2024 $74 billion in debt service payments. And pause there just for us to think about this figure, because that very year that this study was done, Africa received only $79.5 billion in external financing flows, from portfolio investment flows, from FDI, from ODA, and also our own remittances, which constituted over 100 billion of that 174. On debt alone, we are losing more than we are getting. And increases in the payments that Africa experiences when borrowing from the capital markets, over 500% more than when it borrows from multilateral institutions like the African Development Bank. This is significant because capitalization of the African Development Bank will become one of the key recommendations that we have, not only the African Development Bank, but all the other African financial institutions. Because if borrowing from these is 500% less, I leave you to do the economics. And then this heightening fiscal needs, as I've mentioned, continues to take resources away from investing in core sectors. And here I'm saying that amidst these significant needs in Africa and the challenges that I've tried to describe, we see that external financing flows is also oscillating. And the more important thing is that it dries up more when Africa needs it most. COVID-19 comes, countries will have to address their own needs first before they think about giving you aids foreign direct investment. And once this kind of challenges happen, the macro environment becomes riskier and even private capital takes flight. This will underscore one of our key recommendations, which is that Africa's capital must finance Africa's development if we want to achieve the 7% we're talking about. On this slide, you can see the numbers in terms of external financial inflows in Africa. It's going down. The only time that you see it going up like last year is because we had better fiscal controls in countries, macroeconomic reforms in countries that increased interests by external financiers to bring money into the continent. So it is because of portfolio investment flows. That's what happened last year. And a major part of that is not declining, and even when it declines, retains the major share of Africa's external financial flows, is our own diasporan funds, the remittances that comes from Africans living externally. So here it's to make a point that for us to depend or continue to expect depending on ODA or FDI or all those external financing flows is a pipe dream. And with the recent developments in fragmentation in global economies, rise of protectionism, geopolitical challenges we are seeing, anyone thinking of a future of development with aid, I think is very mistaken. The next thing is what I call the paradox of development financing in Africa. Africa's financial outflows every year is almost all the time about 3 times more than the financial inflows. And if you remove Africa's diaspora remittances, it becomes even much more lopsided towards Africa's own resources. And what is this telling us? We have poor risk ratings because of perceptions in the global rating agencies. We lose about $74 billion annually. Illicit financial flows, about $90 billion annually. Corruption, about $148 billion annually. And international profit shifting in global markets, $275 billion annually. Just do the math. We are losing $587 billion every year. That means $1.6 billion daily, including today that we're sitting here at the African Union Commission. And why is this important for the authors of this report? Africa has the agency to block these leakages, because the source of the leakages is poor regulation, state capacity to control corruption, rule of law, and other things that we can do internally. And if we did it already, we're increasing the revenue to drive growth on the continent by almost $600 billion. And I have to say that in this analysis, we didn't include other leakages. Just today, my dear sister Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala was releasing the report, the figures, about 12 billion lost also in illegal fishing in our waters. So if you do this study properly, we might be losing trillions of US dollars. So let's plug those leakages and not continue to face outwards for for financing for Africa's development. And another paradox for Africa. We try to understand what's behind this risk premium that Africa pays, that I have already mentioned to you. And there is no evidence that shows that Africa is riskier than anywhere else. Actually, there is evidence that Africa is the least risky continent, least defaulter in long-term infrastructure investments globally. At 1.9% of default rates, compared to 4.6% in Western Europe and Asia, 6.6% in North America, 10.1% in Latin America, and even up to 12.4% in Eastern Europe. So the paradox here is a continent that is not defaulting has to pay a premium for accessing capital. And that leads to another recommendation we have about reforms in the global financial architecture that is necessary for Africa to be unshackled from the global financial systems that actually upends efforts by African governments. Each time I think of it, it's like Africa is being made to climb a hill to roll a stone up the hill, carrying a sack of sand behind. So we need to think about how to address this. And this gives us the call to action, why this study becomes critical. On that left side is the issue, the debt conundrum that I've talked about, where lack of access to financing forces the countries to invest in less low productivity activities, and that the cycle just goes on, and it's a vicious cycle. And the call to action there is that from this study, we also found, because structural transformation remains uneven in Africa, a lot of Africans remain locked in low productivity sectors. SDG and Agenda 2063 targets are off target in Africa, and without dealing with this, it will remain off target. Close to 9 out of 10 of the world's extremely poor people by 2050, by 2030, it's actually sooner, will be in Africa. And even at current growth trends, it could be that it will take Africa more than a century to be able to reach these goals we're talking about. I hope you'll all say, never should that be. And most of our countries that has broken into the middle income will remain trapped in the middle income trap. And that's why reforms, both domestically and globally, is so central to moving this forward. What are the challenges we have identified that is creating these conundrums in Africa? First, we have domestic challenges that we have to deal with, and I want to focus more on that because that's where we have the urgency to address that challenge and unlock the growth that we're talking about. But we also have external challenges that we have to think about and see how we relate with it, because we cannot develop in a vacuum. Globalization is here to stay, in our view, or maybe call it re-globalization, defining new measures for multilateralism and global cooperation in the economic paradigms. And Africa has a huge opportunity to step up and shape that agenda, because we were not there as countries when the first agenda that has upended our growth was formed in 1944-45. So we have the issues around state capacity, institutions, and governance. State capacity in terms of mobilizing domestic resources, utilizing domestic resources efficiently, and also leveraging the private sector, African private sector, I mean, and also even leveraging resources from the diaspora. We keep hearing hundreds and billions of dollars, but this goes to consumption smoothing, because we don't yet, in many African countries, have structures and systems that ramps up diaspora bonds, securitization of remittances, or even brain circulation to try and tap on the brains of our expats that are living outside the shores of this continent. We have several things we have identified that we need to do to ensure that Africa's capital drives Africa's development. And one conclusion here is that Africa cannot outsource its development to its partners, no matter how well-meaning these partners are. One statement that Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, President of the African Development Bank, always talks about is that your neighbor will not love you so much that he sends your children to school. The next one is investing in productive infrastructure in key high-five sectors. We have already identified those sectors, so we know what to do. And those high-five sectors, UNDP, have already done studies showing us that if only we implemented those activities, investment priorities in the bank's high-fives, we will achieve 90% to 95% of both the SDGs and Agenda 2063. So we know what to do, so the priorities are not unclear. Investing in business capital development is very important. And in all these sectors, there is a critical level of infrastructure that is required for us. That's physical capital, infrastructure that is required to make the business environment easier, reduce logistic costs, and all the other things that makes business function and allows to attract financing for development. And the same is for business capital. This morning, we were just at the meeting of the Alliance for African Financial Institutions. And that's beautiful to see Africans coming together to say, how can we change the narratives? Africa can mobilize resources to finance itself. And I will also actually say Africa has always been the treasure trove of the world where resources for development are mobilized. The problem we have is retaining those resources and using them for growth in our continent. Trade and regional integration become very important. And again, quoting Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala this morning, she said, the best way to grow economies is through trade and trade. He says trade and growth are just the best ways to finance development. So she says, trade more, grow more. You have the financing to be able to drive growth in your economy. Again, we have the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement that sets the pace for us to do it. It's now about enacting and implementing all the other laws and policies and strategies that makes the ACFTA not just a trade area, but an opportunity to grow productivity in Africa, improve manufacturing and industrialization, and also allow free movement of the factors of production, like the customs union, several things that the AU is already discussing. Let's fast track that. But we also need investments in endogenous human capital development and utilization. I've talked about it. Without investments in human capital, we will not be able to break that vicious cycle of poverty. And in our models, we find that the returns to education in Africa, when education is tailored to Africa's priorities, is humongous. We need to think about how to retain, to train in the right skills and competencies that allows, improves technology input in our exports, improves the quality of our education, how we manage public finances, and other things. But again, we have instruments to do that already. The African Development Bank Group just recently launched, under the leadership of President Adesina, the Public Financial Management Academy for Africa. And I'm very glad to know that 51 trainees have already graduated and unleashed to different countries to improve the quality of financing, how we manage finances in Africa. The next that we highlight is implementation of monitoring and evaluation. Africa is awash with good policies, some of them homegrown, some of them done by external experts for us. But the problem is implementation. In every sector, you don't go to any country in Africa and not see relevant policies. When you read them, you feel, wow. But when you see what is happening, you are wondering whether this policy is actually transmitting to action. These are within our capacity, the agency of Africa, as African governments and citizens to change. Let's focus on that. But as we do that, development is like a two-track train. You have to get your house in order, but you have to collaborate with people in the global economy, trade, and other collaboration forms. And that is why we're highlighting things we have also seen that creates a problem for making Africa not to rise consistently, what we call global commons challenges: climate change and climate policy, health pandemics, global conflicts, multipolarization in the global economy, several things that happen outside of Africa that Africa has no control of, but is upending development in Africa. Climate change, for example, Africa is losing 5 to 15% of its GDP growth annually because of trying to address climate change. Yet, the global financing architecture and the climate finance architecture does not allow financing to flow to African countries that are vulnerable to those climate impacts. So governments are forced to use scarce tax revenues to address challenges created elsewhere. We know also of global conflicts and other things. And again, on climate change, how climate policy is being interpreted is driving resources away from high productivity sectors in Africa, like energy. There is no country in the world today that has ever grown on only renewable energy because of its volatility, lack of reliability, and we have had cases in Africa where we try to ramp up renewable energy because that's where global financing goes now, but when you have a risk like decline in rainfall, hydropower stations shut down or the capacity goes down and the country gets into trouble. So we need to think about how these policies are interpreted and deployed for global financing in Africa. Geopolitics of development is very clear. Africa is within the global economy, and what happens outside happens also to be influencing us. And then the systems of global governance, the debt architecture, the global financial architecture, and all those creates significant headwinds for Africa's development. So how then do we break these and be able to implement the actions that we have talked about? We have two buckets of recommendations of key actions that we need in order to drive development in Africa. First one is for Africa to focus on Africa. Focus on homegrown policies in order to drive economic sovereignty. There are specific actions on DRM, as I've mentioned, several actions that needs to be taken to make this possible. And if it was only this one that is done, Africa can raise GDP growth by more than 10%. Second is to deepen domestic revenue mobilization. Again, it's within the agency of African governments to improve tax administration efficiency through digitization and other technologies, to improve the social contract with citizens so that tax compliance will increase, to also improve the quality of non-tax revenues that are to be collected on this continent. Time will not allow me to give you the numbers, but Africa is trailing at about 50% of what other regions are doing with regards to collection of levies, fees, and all these non-tax revenues, or even tax revenues. Another thing that we need to do is to scale up investment in human capital formation and effective utilization, including active policies to attract our remittances into productive sectors. Again, in the report, you will see the details. But again, we need to reinforce regional economic integration and a collective voice. Again, we already have ACFTA, and there are in the report to identify the things that needs to be done to make it really fully effective and unlock intra-regional trade in Africa from below around 15% today to what it should be in order to drive that development. And I need to point out that one of the major things we found that is creating the structural, fiscal, and current account deficits in Africa is the structure of our trade. Focusing on external trade, on commodities, in which markets the prices are by nature volatile and we have no control of. So we are price takers. And then you cannot plan based on volatile revenues from your export markets. Again, there are policies and actions in the report on how to actually ramp up regional economic integration, trade, and all the things that needs to be done. And I have to say, some policies that I see emerging in many African countries confound me. We need to think about free movement of people instead of building more walls. If factors of production does not move freely, manufacturing cannot thrive. Let's learn from European Union. Let's learn from the United States, made up of several states. We can do it. The next one is for us to establish the Africa Financial Stability Mechanism, which I will speak to briefly later, so I will leave explaining it here. But we also need to strengthen state capacity, institutions, and governance. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, all studies we've done shows us that countries that get this one right rises to a high level of growth and sustains it over time. It's like the temperature that defines the flow of capital in an economy. Let's get our macroeconomic prudence right. Let's get our public financial management right. Let's get actions to address corruption and illicit flows right. We can do it. There are several other actions here which I will leave you to look at, but I will highlight two more. We need to change our mindsets and our narratives. The wrongest, if I use that word so that you remember it, because I know it's not correct, the wrongest word that I have, narrative that I have seen and heard since I was born is that Africa is poor. Africa is not poor. Because if Africa was poor, the colonial masters would not risk their lives to come for resources in Africa. If Africa was poor, neocolonialism will not happen. So what is it that external parties see in Africa that we don't? That's always scrambled for Africa. What do you think they're scrambling for? Resources for development. Those resources belong to Africa for Africans. And as leaders of the continent, we need to make those resources work for Africa's development. African Development Bank's annual meetings this year will be focusing a lot more on that. But changing our mindsets also comes from knowing that we can and having that we can attitude. Let's stop begging, because beggars have no choice. They never have, and they will never have. So let's try as much as possible to grow that confidence in every child in Africa that Africa can develop itself. Because truly, the resources we have shown in this report, Africa can not only develop itself, but shape the future of development of the rest of the world. With 40% of global minerals deposits in Africa, 65% of remaining arable land in Africa, a lot of rare earth minerals, what we do with our resources shapes development globally. And that is why we have looked at the issue of measuring the green wealth of countries. And we find in that report that even, just give me a few minutes.
No, the CEO of AUDA-NEPAD has to leave shortly, and we'd like for her to make a few remarks. But you'll also have an opportunity, Professor Rama, to also deal with the Inclusive and Sustainable Growth report, but just in the interest of time, because her session is going to be discussed shortly, and we'd like to give her an opportunity to provide a few reflections, and we'll come back to you.
Thank you very much.
Just before Her Excellency does give her comments, it is of note that she is indeed a private sector policy advisor of note, a former director in the office of the Secretary General of the United Nations, and currently the CEO of the African Union Development Agency, New Partnership for African Development. I hate acronyms, but AUDA-NEPAD for short. Please give a very warm applause to Mrs. Nados Bekele-Thomas. Over to you, Excellency.
Thank you very much, Victor. Thank you very much, Victor, and thank you so much, Prof. Kevin Rama. Really, you know, I am sitting here and I thought, you know, I was taking really a lecture, which is excellent, you know, and really, thank you very much for always your insightful presentation. I'm so sorry I have to be brief because the Heads of State and Government Orientation report of my organization is being discussed in a few minutes, and I need to be there, so my apologies. First and foremost, from the presentation and reading through this book, there are several things that are very of critical importance. One is the chief optimist, you know, the president of ADB is really trying to convince us through evidence that it is possible. Africa can no longer export wealth and manage poverty. Africa is going to be wealthy, and we need to wake up. Two is implementation. We Africans, we've been talking and talking and talking, and Prof. Orama just said it, we need to start implementing. Three is that we need to harmonize all these studies. When there is a study, for example, this one, which is fantastic, and we have been part of it, and we are privileged to be part of it, and I want to thank my brother, the commissioner here, who is always pushing me to read and to do something about it. But we need also to have a harmonized approach to it. We just finished designing our second 10-year implementation plan. Most of the action points are there. But what we need to do is this gives us a deeper analysis of the priority actions. And my pledge to you is to take this and to deepen that document and make it an actionable program with a monitoring and evaluation tool. We have developed a dashboard in every country to really figure out where the progress of each country is. And that would also be informed by this, and then we would be able to monitor this together. I think we have to really be very strategic and use our time, our energy, and our resources efficiently and effectively. In our document, we said, $5.3 trillion is already planned, within the context of the second 10-year implementation plan. The gap is $3 trillion, and we know for sure we don't have to go far. Let's implement this and, strengthen, the systems, the mechanisms that are there, and make bold action and try to capture what is ours that we export elsewhere. The institutional funds that are kept there, the illicit flows that are there, the corruption that we as individuals, as Africans, can control. These are the things that will enable us to be prosperous. Talking about our potential forever is not going to add anything. Taking action will take us somewhere. And I would like to pledge as the implementing agency of the African Union, the development agency that they have put to coordinate the activities of the development support and development activities in the continent, monitor and evaluate, be the knowledge repository, and also mobilize the resources. This is really a tool for me, and I will use it effectively and efficiently. Thank you very much, and thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Nados Bekele-Thomas, for the call to make this an actionable and not simply a policy document, but also for promising to utilize it for your agency and in the interest of the African Union and Agenda 2063. At this point, we'd like to call on Professor Jeffrey Sachs, a globally recognized public policy analyst, a professor at Columbia University, where he heads the Center for Sustainable Development Solutions, and for several years was a special advisor to the UN Secretary General. He is a prolific author, an incisive commentator, but more importantly, a friend of Africa. Please give Professor Jeffrey Sachs a warm round of applause.
Thank you very much. I'm going to speak fast because before Nardos leaves, she's so important in this, I wanted to catch just a couple of minutes. The main point is that Africa, as an aggregate, should be able to achieve the fastest growth in the world economy for the next 40 years. That's in part because Africa starts as the poorest region. It starts as the region that still needs the most investments in high return areas, especially in human capital and in infrastructure. And that means, and it's demonstrated in hundreds of studies, that there is a potential for convergence in economies, meaning that countries that start out poor per capita can grow faster. The idea of Africa growing at 7% per capita per year for the next 40 years is ambitious but realistic. When you grow at 7% per capita, you double every 10 years. And so when we were asked at the beginning, could you reach $65,000? Well, if Africa were to grow at 7% per year between now and 2063, the answer is that Africa would be at $71,000 per capita. It's feasible. This is what China has achieved. This is what India is achieving right now. This is what Africa can achieve. To do that, there has to be much higher investment levels than now. I know you have to go, but boosting investment is key. A lot of that is going to have to be financed by international capital flows, not by domestic finance, because the economies are poor today, but the world is rich. And so there's $30 trillion of annual saving, and several hundred billion easily can be attracted to Africa, both in equity and in debt. But it's not happening right now adequately. One of the reasons is the region gets bad advice from the IMF, terrible advice. The advice is don't borrow, you have a debt crisis. This is wrong. If you take debt today and it is properly used, and you double and then double and then double and then double your economy over the next 40 years, the economy is 16 times larger. The debt to GDP of debt taken on today is a 16th of what it is in 40 years. My advice is borrow a lot more, but at long term. Don't get into a short-term debt trap, but don't lose the chance to invest in high-return investments. The single highest return investment in Africa is a young child. I mean that not morally, I mean that economically. If you invest in a young child today in the quality of their education, ensure that they have at least 12 years of quality education minimum, but probably 15 years is what's needed in the 21st century, you will get compound returns of about 20% on that child. That's better than Silicon Valley. It is. But the governments can't afford that right now. So we need financing for education. And no joke financing, and not financing for education 20 years from now, and not education where there's no school, no online, no teachers, no digital, no devices, no data. Come on, that's not education in the 21st century. So we have to work out a practical investment plan for infrastructure and for human capital. In the chapter that I wrote for this study, and I was privileged to be part of it, I used a quantitative model to show borrow, make the debt reach 200% of GDP, 250% of GDP. That's okay. If it's well invested, it comes down to 40% of GDP 40 years from now. In other words, the IMF's got it all wrong. They use a static model. They say if you're poor, don't reach more than 30% of GDP in debt or 40% of GDP in debt. I'm ashamed of this because these are my students there. I gave them a PhD, but what I taught them was if the returns to investment are higher than the cost of capital, take it. And the returns on investing in education, on electrification, on transport, on shipping, on ports, on digital are far higher than the cost of capital. But of course, we also have to work on both ends of this. What should be invested, long-term public investment strategies, and the cost of capital. And for that, we need a massive increase of capitalization of the African Development Bank and the other multilateral development banks. The scale is just far too low. To lend $5 to $10 billion a year out of the African Development Bank, it should be 10 times that. Literally. Not just because it would be a nice thing, but it really needs to be much bigger. And it could be. And by the way, it should be mainly African resources. And one nice thing about the Trump administration, okay? You will know you're on your own, okay? So we want Africa, I want Africa, you want Africa to be a high-income, advanced region in 40 years. No doubt it's feasible. I'm telling you, no doubt. You have an Agenda 2063. You need the financing behind it. You need the NEPAD plans actually invested in, all of the rail, the road, the ports. You need a unified Africa so the borders are not blocking you, because the Congress of Berlin and its aftermath left you with 55 separate countries. And the only way some of these borders were ever drawn was by people who never even visited. Okay? It's all right. It's possible to live within that, but not for trade and finance and infrastructure. That has to be region-wide. That has to be truly an African continental free trade area. And it can be. Why not? It's going to enrich everybody. Every president should be happy to be part of this. They're all going to be enriched. And I would say to any leader in this continent, you can't do it except as part of a rich continent. So it's not a matter of I'm going to do it faster than my neighbor. You're going to do it because your neighbor's also going to be able to do it. And so this is my basic point. There's no magic to getting rich. There's also no shortcut. It's investing. Part of the investing is every year the child needs to advance, learn what is appropriate, get a good education. That's the most important investment of all. And the rest of it is the physical infrastructure, the climate resilience, and the other things that will be needed. The business will come. That's how business does it. They don't really care as long as they can make a profit. And if you want to attract foreign investment, the first thing they're going to ask is, are there the skilled workers around? That's what they ask, actually. They ask, do I have engineers here? Am I going to be able to make this plant operate? Is it going to work? They want to know about the skilled workforce. When I spend my time in Southeast Asia, as I do, in Malaysia or Indonesia or Cambodia, everyone, the only question that they're invested, where are the engineers? How am I going to build? Is this the right place to have the factory? That's what they want to know. So all the industrialization can occur, but make the engineers, make the people who can run the factories, of course. And with the beauty of online education, all of this can be done so much faster. The training can be done so much pervasively. You have a Africa-wide university now, put online education, master's degrees, have the biggest revolution of education, and finance what's needed, and don't be shy about the debt part of it, because if we do the arithmetic on the Excel spreadsheet, what looks large today is minimal 40 years from now. And not investing in it is a crusher, because 40 years from now you'll be at the same level you are now, which makes no sense. And the IMF can't get that through their heads for the last 40 years, honestly. And the reason is it's at 19th and Pennsylvania Avenue, okay? It's not in Addis Ababa, it's not in Accra, it's not in Dar es Salaam, it's not in Dakar. If it were, everyone would have figured it out a long time ago. So this is a great report. Go for rapid growth, do the arithmetic for it, but then build the African Development Bank and the other institutions at a 10-time scale, and go for growth, and you'll find the money flowing into the continent. It'll flow in because everyone will know this is the fastest growing region in the whole world. We need to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs, for your optimism about Africa's long-term outlook, for providing us with exemplars to prove the point, as well as the call for increased investments in high-return infrastructure, particularly the infrastructure of the mind for young children, education for 12 to 15 years, resulting in compound returns, as well as long-term investments in critical infrastructure as well as bringing down the cost of capital, and a call for a much more unified Africa, particularly when it concerns trade and integrated infrastructure, as well as a call for growing the African Development Bank at a scale of 10 times. Thank you so much for being with us. We know you do have to run to another event. Kindly give Professor Sachs a warm round of applause as he and his team leave. We will now go back to Professor Oramah, and in the interest of time, because Commissioner Muchanga also has to go on. Thank you very much. Professor Muchanga, His Excellency Ambassador Muchanga, I just promoted you to Professor, Commissioner, more than well deserved. I gather from Professor Oramah that he will wrap up in about 5 minutes. If you could kindly do that, that would be very much appreciated, and we'll come to the close shortly.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I will be wrapping up in 5 minutes because Jeff, Professor Sachs, has already addressed the next recommendations that we had for our development partners. First is that mindset change. I can't say it better than Prof has said it. The models we use for global finance is not good. So we need to change that. So we need to learn that Africa is not a commodities market. So let's change that mindset and see Africa as a place where we can invest to industrialize, we can invest in education, we can do all these investments and make debt affordable to Africa. The second one is reforming the global financial architecture, whether it be climate, debt, equity, everything that has to do with financial flows is currently not allowing finances to come to the continent, sometimes because of perceived biases or historical path dependencies in what people thought Africa is and should be. So we need to reform the credit rating agencies' methodologies, which is costing Africa $74 billion annually. We need to also reform the IMF and World Bank debt sustainability frameworks, which Jeff has talked about, but also need to simplify climate finance flows to allow that financing to go to countries that need them most. But we need to also implement, in terms of changing the systems of national accounts globally, to allow for measuring green wealth of countries. Let us factor both the assets that are locked in natural capital and the flow of ecosystem services from natural capital into what national GDPs are measured with. Currently, we have a report that we've published on this and launched in Baku under the leadership of President Sassou Nguesso and President William Ruto. And we find that just by taking into account carbon sequestration of forests only, for which we now have a carbon market, Africa's GDP will rise by 66.1 billion. For one country we use as a case study, the GDP would rise from 2.5 billion to about 10.7 billion. Just one flow from forests alone. Can you imagine what it will mean if the assets in natural capital, both the stocks and flows, are taken into consideration? Because that's actually the substructure that grows economies everywhere. We also need to accelerate the scale of low-cost concessional financing for Africa. And this comes at a great time because ADF 17 replenishment, the African Development Fund, is ongoing now. African heads of states, African governments, and development partners, there is need to increase that financing, the capitalization of that institution, so that low-cost financing can go to unlock this growth that Jeff has talked about. But also SDR rechanneling is a low-hanging fruit, and it's also a call to African heads of states and heads of states globally to make that possible. Leveraging the private sector is fundamental, and then improving access to emergency financing is also necessary. African continent is already doing this, and if I just talk about the Africa Financial Stability Mechanism, which we've also recommended, but like I said in the beginning, our heads of states are ahead of the curve. It's currently before them for approval. And we find in our work that this instrument that will focus on debt refinancing in Africa will save Africa $20 billion in debt servicing costs by 2035 when fully implemented. The reports are available so you can find the details. But there is no other financial institution globally or in Africa focusing on debt refinancing that has been ripping Africa of the scarce fiscal resources for development in Africa. I have talked about the green wealth of countries, and this is just the example of that country, Central African Republic, when only carbon sequestration function of forests in that country is factored into GDP through natural capital accounting. The GDP grows from 2.5 to 10.6 billion. That's an 8.1 billion increment by measuring what we already have. And we also find that many countries' national systems of accounts are not up to date. So just by rebasing Africa's GDP, a lot of the mileage in achieving that 7% will already happen. So the African Development Bank Group is committed to working with countries through our statistics department to rebase GDPs so that we can actually measure the true worth of Africa as it is today, but also building capacity in natural capital accounting and systems of ecosystem environmental accounts in order to make sure that this happens as well. In closing, some people might think this is lofty, is too optimistic, is challenging, but Einstein reminds us that in the middle of these difficulties lies opportunities. Let's turn these challenges we have in the global financial architecture in Africa's economies to opportunities for quadrupling, doubling, quadrupling, quintupling Africa's growth, because it's possible. Because we cannot use an old map, this again from Einstein, to explore the new world. The current models is rigged against Africa. So let's come up with an African model, which we have in this report, and we'll be willing to work with countries to domesticate those models so that we can unlock these opportunities. Finally, Africa has what it takes to double its annual GDP growth and GDP per capita growth over the next 40 years and achieve Agenda 2063 if the key actions recommended in this report are judiciously implemented. Let's do it.
Professor Kevin Oramah, thank you for the rigorous intellectual work that has gone into this, as well as your coordinating activities with the African Union and other partners in bringing us to this point. I believe that copies of these frameworks are available for distribution. Much food for thought here. In the middle of challenges is opportunity. We cannot use an old map to explore a new world. And as Dr. Akinwumi Adesina constantly says, Africa cannot develop at the mercy of external financial systems. The African Financial Stability Mechanism is about ownership, resilience, and securing our own financial sovereignty. Permit me, before we bring this event to a close, to acknowledge and to recognize my brother, my colleague, and friend, Dr. Patrick Olomo, who really has been integral to this process and getting us to this point. Please give him a very warm round of applause here. And to bring our event, this really trajectory transforming event, to a close, once again, it is our pleasure to invite to provide closing comments His Excellency Ambassador Albert Muchanga, AUC Commissioner Extraordinaire. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Giving closing remarks for one basic reason. On the 15th March or earlier, I'm lucky to be leaving this place. My mandate has come to an end. But there are a number of things which I would like the team to continue following up. But before I do that, first and foremost, both here and in the virtual space, I would like to thank each and every one of you for coming to this event. Some of our colleagues, the Chief Executive Officer of Auda NEPAD, and Professor Jeffrey Sachs could not be with us for a long time. The 5-minute interview, I promised that I would be back in 5 minutes, and it was over in 5 minutes. I came here for the closing remark. So thank you very much for their presence. I think the message is very clear. It's doable. We can do it. So let us do it. But as we do it, a number of institutions that the African Development Bank and the African Union Commission should work with the agency to establish. The first one, which is supposed to be private sector driven, is the African Credit Rating Agency. We have talked about this operationalization for a long time. Now, my request is that the African Development Bank, African Export-Import Bank, and the APRM, and the African Union Commission should really mobilize the African private sector to take ownership of the Africa Credit Rating Agency. Professor Sachs was talking of borrowing and high returns. Africa has high returns, but the risk perception is equally high. So we need to ensure that that is undermined. The other one, I think it's very, very clear. The Africa Financing Stability Mechanism, we need to operationalize it as soon as possible. So you work on that one. And then the third one is the Africa Monetary Institute. And it does talk of local currency financing. The best way of moving very rapidly towards local currency financing is to lay the groundwork for a single African currency. And the African Central Bank is key to that, and this starting point is the African Monetary Institute. Now, with the study itself, the strategic framework on key actions to achieve inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa. My request to you, Dr. Olomo, and your team is that you put this on the draft agenda of the upcoming meeting of the Specialized Technical Committee on Finance, Monetary Affairs, Integration, even Economic Planning and Integration. And when you put it on their paper, indicate that those who want to have it domesticated, they can get technical assistance from the African Development Bank by using the econometric model. That's the first one. The second point is that, like I indicated in the opening remarks, there is going to be an assembly decision that the chairperson of the African Union Commission and the president of the African Development Bank should provide annual reports to the assembly on the implementation of the strategic framework at national, regional, and continental level. So if the member states commit at the level of the Specialized Technical Committee, they go home and start the process of domestication. And of course, we had the request from our colleague at Auda NEPAD. We need to align. I think here, this document answers two critical questions. The first one is that the first aspiration of the African Union Agenda 2063, where Africa aspires to attain progress anchored on inclusive growth and sustainable development. So we are operationalizing the African Union Agenda 2063. Then within the African Union Agenda 2063, again, there's a target that beginning in 2023, the African economy should grow at 7% per annum on a sustaining basis. The groundwork has been laid. Then there's also another target, which if you go through the document, it also says, actually more than one target. The third target is that for the the Agenda 2063 to be implemented, 75% to 95% of the resources required for its implementation should come from domestic resources. And Professor Jeffrey Sachs was saying, if we have to develop, we have to invest massively. And Professor Orama talked about the need to galvanize the process of implementation of the agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area. That brings us to the other target in the African Union Agenda 2063, which is that by 2023, an African customs union / common market must be established. So you link all these, then you have a lot of work before you. So with those remarks, it's now my pleasure to formally bring this meeting to a close and thank each and every one of you for coming. And let's keep the spirit of progress. The African Union agenda says the Africa want. So if we wanted to get to the Africa want, let's say, yes, we can. Yes, we can. Let's move on.
Yes, we can, and let's do it. I'm going to ask that the authors of these reports, that they join us on the platform for a quick family photograph. Yeah. I see Desiree, I see other members of the team here. Please join us on the platform for a very quick photograph call here. Thank you very much.